Three spoiled teenagers thought they could destroy the new principal's career with a viral humiliation video. They had no idea they were about to mess with a decorated Marine commander who had faced down enemy combatants in 2 war zones. What happened next left the entire school district speechless and these bullies begging for mercy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood in the empty hallway of Oakwood High. School at 6:30 in the morning, her sensible black heels clicking against the polished linoleum as she made her way toward the principal's office. The October morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the trophy cases that lined the walls, each one filled with evidence of the school's proud athletic legacy. At 42, Sarah carried herself with a quiet confidence that most people mistook for simple professionalism, never suspecting the steel beneath her composed exterior. She paused outside her office door, fumbling with the keys, while balancing a steaming cup of coffee and a stack of budget reports that seemed to grow heavier each day. The nameplate beside the door still looked foreign to her. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Principal. 3 months into the job, and she still felt like an imposter wearing civilian clothes, playing a role she wasn't entirely sure she was qualified for. The transition from military life to the chaotic world of public education had been more challenging than any deployment she'd endured during her 15 years as a Marine. Inside her corner office, Sarah settled behind the large oak desk that had belonged to her predecessor, Frank Garrison, who had retired after 2 decades of service to Oakwood High. The walls were still bare, except for her credentials hanging in simple black frames: master's degree in educational administration, various military commendations that she kept deliberately understated, and a single photograph of her 14-year-old son David in his freshman football uniform. She had deliberately chosen not to display the more impressive aspects of her military service, knowing that in this suburban California community, being seen as too authoritative or intimidating could work against her. The morning routine had become sacred to Sarah. She arrived early to review the day's challenges in solitude, strategizing like she once had for base operations in hostile territory. Oakwood High served 1,200 students from families that ranged from tech executives to blue-collar workers, but the school's reputation rested heavily on its successful athletic programs and high college acceptance rates. The pressure from parents and the school board was relentless, particularly given the budget constraints and declining test scores that had plagued the district for the past 2 years. Sarah opened her laptop and began reviewing the incident reports from the previous day. 3 fights in the cafeteria, 2 cases of suspected vaping in the bathrooms, and another complaint from Mrs. Hayes about disruptive behavior in her English class. The same names appeared repeatedly: Connor Walsh, Madison Pierce, and Blake Rodriguez. These 3 seniors had been testing boundaries since the first week of school, seemingly determined to establish that the new principal was just another authority figure they could manipulate or intimidate. Connor Walsh was particularly problematic. The 6'2" football captain came from one of Millbrook's most prominent families, his father serving as a city councilman who wielded considerable influence over school board decisions. Connor had the kind of natural charisma that made other students gravitate toward him, but Sarah recognized the calculating intelligence behind his charming smile. He was the type of leader who could inspire loyalty or fear with equal ease, and he seemed to view her appointment as a personal challenge to his unofficial dominion over the school's social hierarchy. Madison Pierce represented a different kind of threat entirely. The 16-year-old junior had built a substantial social media following by documenting the drama and social dynamics of Oakwood High, turning teenage conflicts into entertainment for thousands of online followers. Her father owned several successful car dealerships throughout the region, and Madison had grown up believing that money and influence could solve any problem. She possessed an intuitive understanding of how to weaponize social media, turning minor incidents into viral scandals that could destroy reputations overnight. Blake Rodriguez completed the trio as Connor's closest friend and most reliable enforcer. The basketball player's family owned a thriving construction company, and Blake had inherited both his father's imposing physical presence and his quick temper. While Connor preferred psychological manipulation and Madison wielded social media, like a scalpel, Blake represented the threat of physical intimidation that kept other students in line. Together, these three had created an atmosphere of tension that rippled throughout the entire school. Teachers complained privately about their disruptive behavior, but were reluctant to take strong disciplinary action, knowing that the students' influential parents had previously caused problems for educators who crossed their children. The previous principal, Frank Garrison, had essentially reached an unspoken accommodation with these families, allowing minor infractions to slide in exchange for their support during budget discussions and board meetings. Sarah had no intention of continuing that arrangement. Her military background had taught her that small compromises with problematic individuals inevitably led to larger problems down the line. In the Marines, she had learned that leadership meant setting clear boundaries and enforcing them consistently, regardless of who might be inconvenienced by the consequences. The challenge was adapting those principles to a civilian environment where her authority was far more limited and the political considerations far more complex. The first real confrontation had occurred during her second week on the job. Connor had been 20 minutes late to first period, strolling into class with the casual confidence of someone who expected no consequences. When his teacher, Mrs. Hayes, had attempted to mark him tardy, Connor had simply smiled and said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. My dad mentioned that you should probably check with the principal's office before writing me up for anything." The implicit threat was clear: cause problems for Connor, and his father would cause problems for the teacher. Mrs. Hayes, a dedicated educator with 15 years of experience, had immediately sent Connor to Sarah's office. The young man had arrived with the same casual confidence, settling into the chair across from her desk, as if he owned the place. Sarah had remained calm and professional, explaining the school's attendance policy and issuing a detention that Connor would need to serve that afternoon. Connor's response had been revealing. "Dr. Mitchell, I think you might not understand how things work here at Oakwood. My family has been part of this community for generations. We're not the kind of people who serve detentions." His tone had remained respectful, but the underlying message was unmistakable. He considered himself above the rules that applied to other students. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah had simply smiled and replied, "Mr. Walsh, I think you might not understand how things work now that I'm here. The rules apply to everyone equally, regardless of their family's history or influence. Your detention is scheduled for today. At 3:15, I suggest you arrange your schedule accordingly." The detention had been served, but Sarah knew it was only the opening move in a much larger game. Connor's father had called the next day, ostensibly to introduce himself, but actually to gauge whether Sarah would be amenable to the same flexible approach that had characterized her predecessor's leadership style. The conversation had been polite but tense, with Councilman Walsh making several pointed references to the challenges facing the school district and the importance of maintaining strong community support. Madison Pierce had attempted a different approach entirely. 2 days after Connor's detention, She had posted a carefully crafted video on her social media accounts, expressing concern about the negative atmosphere that seemed to be developing at Oakwood High under the new administration. The video never mentioned Sarah by name, but the implications were clear to anyone familiar with recent events. Madison spoke earnestly about the importance of understanding the unique culture of their school and suggested that outsiders might not appreciate the traditions and relationships that had made Oakwood High successful. The video had garnered significant attention from students and parents throughout the district, generating hundreds of comments that ranged from supportive to critical. Sarah had watched it twice, analyzing Madison's technique with the same careful attention she had once devoted to enemy propaganda broadcasts. The girl was skilled at manipulating public opinion, using emotional appeals and subtle implications to advance her agenda without making statements that could be directly challenged. Blake Rodriguez had been more direct in his approach. During a crowded lunch period, he had made several loud comments about the new principal's lack of understanding regarding the school's athletic programs. Blake had questioned whether someone with no background in education or sports could effectively support the teams that brought pride and recognition to Oakwood High. His comments had been calculated to reach the ears of student athletes and their parents, many of whom were already concerned about potential changes to policies that had previously given athletes certain privileges and accommodations. Sarah had observed all of these maneuvers with the trained eye of someone who had once been responsible for maintaining order among thousands of Marines in high-stress environments. She recognized the coordinated nature of the challenge she was facing. These three students weren't acting independently. They were executing a carefully planned campaign designed to test her authority and potentially force her resignation if she proved unwilling to accommodate their expectations. What they didn't understand was that Sarah Mitchell had faced down much more serious threats than privileged teenagers with influential parents. During her second deployment, she had been responsible for managing a forward operating base that came under regular attack, coordinating the activities of multiple units while ensuring that supply lines remained open and morale stayed high. She had learned to identify potential threats long before they materialized and to respond with measured force that neutralized problems without creating unnecessary casualties. The military had also taught her the importance of gathering intelligence before taking action. Sarah spent her first month carefully observing the dynamics within the school, identifying allies and potential obstacles, and developing a comprehensive understanding of the formal and informal power structures that shaped daily operations. She spoke with teachers, custodial staff, cafeteria workers, and administrative assistants, recognizing that these individuals often possessed more accurate insights into student behavior than the official reports that crossed her desk. Tom Bradley, the vice principal who had been passed over for the principal position, had initially viewed Sarah with some resentment. However, his attitude had gradually shifted as he observed her methodical approach to problem solving and her genuine respect for the expertise of longtime staff members. Tom had worked at Oakwood High for 8 years and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of student histories, family dynamics, and the subtle relationships that influenced school culture. Through these conversations, Sarah learned that the current situation had been building for several years. The previous principal's accommodating approach had gradually created a two-tiered disciplinary system where students from influential families faced minimal consequences for behaviors that would result in serious punishment for others. This disparity had bred resentment among teachers and students who felt that the rules didn't apply equally to everyone. Sarah also discovered that her appointment had been controversial from the beginning. Several community members had expected the position to go to someone with deeper local roots, preferably someone who had attended Oakwood High themselves or had children who were successful graduates. Her military background was viewed with suspicion by some parents who worried that she would bring an overly authoritarian approach to school management. These concerns had been amplified by Connor's father and his allies on the school board, who had quietly suggested that Sarah's lack of traditional educational leadership experience might make her unsuitable for the challenges facing Oakwood High. They had painted her as an outsider who didn't understand the unique needs of their community, someone who might disrupt the delicate balance that had made the school successful. What these critics didn't realize was that Sarah's military experience had taught her lessons about leadership that no traditional educational program could provide. She understood how to build consensus among diverse groups, how to maintain discipline without destroying morale, and how to make difficult decisions under pressure while accepting full responsibility for the consequences. More importantly, her years in the Marines had taught her to recognize when she was being tested and to respond in ways that established clear boundaries without escalating conflicts unnecessarily. She knew that the next few weeks would be crucial in determining whether she could establish her authority at Oakwood High or whether the resistance she was facing would force her to seek employment elsewhere. As Sarah finished reviewing the morning reports and prepared for another day of challenges, she reflected on the conversation she'd had with her son David the previous evening. As a freshman at Oakwood High, he was navigating his own set of social dynamics while trying to avoid being identified as the principal's son. David had inherited his mother's observational skills and her instinct for reading people, and his insights into student culture had proven invaluable as Sarah worked to understand the environment she was trying to lead. "Mom," David had said while they shared a quiet dinner, "some of the older kids are saying that you're not going to last. They think Connor and his friends are going to make things so difficult that you'll quit before Christmas." His tone had been matter-of-fact rather than worried, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. Sarah had smiled and ruffled his hair. "What do you think, kiddo? Do I look like someone who gives up easily?" David had grinned and shaken his head, but Sarah knew that her son was picking up on tensions that could affect his own social standing at school. The pressure on both of them was mounting, and Sarah was increasingly aware that her next moves would determine not just her own future, but her son's experience at Oakwood High as well. The morning bell rang, signaling the beginning of another day, and Sarah steeled herself for whatever challenges Connor Walsh and his allies might present. She had no way of knowing that within hours, these three students would make a mistake so catastrophic that it would reveal exactly who they were dealing with, transforming a quiet power struggle into a confrontation that would change everything. At Oakwood High forever. The second week of October brought unseasonably warm weather to Millbrook, and with it, a restless energy that seemed to permeate every corner of Oakwood High School. Sarah noticed the shift during her morning walk through the hallways, observing the way students clustered in tight groups, their conversations stopping abruptly when she approached. The atmosphere felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to vibrate with potential energy. It was during third period when everything changed. Sarah was reviewing quarterly budget projections in her office when her assistant, Mrs. Chen, knocked softly on the door. The older woman's expression was troubled, and she clutched a manila folder against her chest like a shield. "Dr. Mitchell, I think you need to see this," Mrs. Chen said, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced over her shoulder nervously before closing the door behind her. "It was anonymously left on my desk this morning, but I have a feeling about who might have been responsible." Sarah accepted the folder, noting how Mrs. Chen's hands trembled slightly as she passed it over. Inside were printouts of social media, posts, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be military service records. Her military service records. The documents were incomplete and taken out of context, but they painted a picture that someone had clearly spent considerable time researching. The first page was a screenshot of Madison Pierce's latest video post, uploaded just hours earlier. In it, Madison sat in what appeared to be her bedroom, surrounded by the kind of carefully curated backdrop that had become her trademark. Her expression was one of concerned innocence as she spoke directly into the camera. "I've been doing some research about our new principal, and I think the Oakwood High community deserves to know who is really running our school," Madison began, her voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and vulnerability that had made her social media presence so effective. Dr. Sarah Mitchell isn't just new to education, she's new to civilian life entirely. Did you know that until just 3 years ago, she was a military commander responsible for managing combat operations overseas? The video continued for nearly 10 minutes, with Madison carefully weaving together facts and implications to create a narrative that portrayed Sarah as potentially dangerous and completely unsuited for educational leadership. She never directly stated that Sarah was violent or authoritarian, but the subtext was unmistakable. Madison spoke about the different mindset required for military service versus education, questioning whether someone trained for warfare could understand the nurturing environment that students needed to thrive. The most damaging segment came near the end, when Madison displayed what appeared to be a military citation describing Sarah's role in managing personnel during a particularly intense deployment. Madison read selected portions aloud, emphasizing phrases like maintaining order under hostile conditions and enforcing discipline through decisive action. The teenager's interpretation made Sarah's commendations sound ominous rather than heroic. "I'm not saying there's anything wrong with military service," Madison concluded, her tone carefully modulated to suggest deep concern rather than accusation. "But I think parents have a right to know that our principal's previous experience involved making life and death decisions in combat zones. Is that really the background we want for someone responsible for nurturing our children's emotional and academic development?" The video had already been viewed over 15,000 times and shared across multiple platforms. The comments section was a battlefield of opinions, with some defending Sarah's service, while others expressed alarm about having a military commander running their local high school. Several parents had already called the district office demanding more information about Sarah's background and qualifications. But the social media campaign was only the beginning. The remaining documents in the folder revealed the depth of the research that had been conducted. Someone had obtained copies of newspaper articles from Sarah's hometown detailing her divorce proceedings and the custody arrangements for David. The articles had been carefully highlighted to emphasize any mentions of her demanding schedule and the challenges of military life on family relationships. Most disturbing was a partially redacted military incident report that described a confrontation Sarah had mediated between two subordinates who had gotten into a physical altercation. The report praised Sarah's handling of the situation and her ability to restore unit cohesion, but taken out of context and presented selectively, it could be interpreted as evidence of a pattern of dealing with conflict through intimidation. Sarah set the folder aside and looked up at Mrs. Chen, who had been watching her review the materials with obvious anxiety. The older woman had worked at Oakwood High for over a decade and had seen her share of political battles. But this level of coordinated attack on a sitting principal was unprecedented. "How many people do you think have seen this?" Sarah asked, her voice remaining steady despite the anger building in her chest. "The video has been shared in at least 3 parent Facebook groups that I know of," Mrs. Chen replied. "And Connor, Walsh was showing printed copies to other students during lunch yesterday. I overheard him telling people that they had a right to know who they were really dealing with." Sarah nodded slowly, recognizing the sophisticated nature of the attack she was facing. This wasn't the impulsive behavior of frustrated teenagers. It was a carefully planned campaign designed to undermine her credibility and force her resignation. The timing was particularly strategic, coming just before the monthly school board meeting where her performance would be evaluated for the first time since taking the position. The research required to compile these materials would have taken weeks of dedicated effort. Someone had contacted her previous duty stations, searched public records in multiple states, and even tracked down news coverage from her hometown. This level of investigation suggested resources and connections that went far beyond what typical high school students could marshal on their own. Sarah's military training had taught her to analyze threats systematically, and she quickly identified the various ways this campaign could damage her position. The selective presentation of her service record made her sound like a dangerous authoritarian rather than a dedicated leader. The emphasis on her divorce and single motherhood played into stereotypes about women who prioritized career over family. Most importantly, the timing coincided with budget discussions, where parent support would be crucial for maintaining programs and staff positions. The phone began ringing almost immediately after Mrs. Chen left her office. The first call came from Tom Bradley, who had heard about the video from students and wanted to warn Sarah about the brewing controversy. The second call was from Superintendent Williams, whose tone suggested that he was already fielding complaints from concerned parents and school board members. "Sarah, I need to understand what we're dealing with here," Superintendent Williams said without preamble. "I've got board members asking questions about your background check and whether we properly vetted your qualifications. Parents are demanding to know why they weren't informed about your military service during the hiring process." Sarah took a deep breath, recognizing that her response to this moment would likely determine her future at Oakwood High. "Superintendent Williams, my military service was clearly documented in my application materials and discussed during my interview process. I've never hidden my background, and I'm proud of my service to our country. The issue isn't whether this information was available, but how it's being presented and by whom." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Sarah providing context for the documents that had been selectively shared and explaining how her military experience had actually prepared her for educational leadership. Superintendent Williams seemed reassured by her explanations, but he made it clear that she would need to address the concerns publicly and demonstrate that she could handle the political pressure without allowing it to disrupt school operations. After ending the call, Sarah sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what was happening. She had faced enemy fire, managed personnel crises, and navigated complex political situations during her military career. But this felt different. The attack was personal in a way that military conflicts never were, targeting not just her professional qualifications, but her character and her fitness as a mother. More importantly, she recognized that this wasn't really about her at all. Connor Walsh and his allies were using her as a symbol in a larger battle over who controlled Oakwood High School. They had correctly identified that undermining her authority was the key to maintaining their privileged position within the school's hierarchy. If they could force her resignation or make her so politically weak that she couldn't challenge them, they would have effectively won control over the institution. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to her office. Several teachers stopped by to express their support, sharing their own frustrations with the entitled behavior they had observed from certain students and their families. Mrs. Hayes was particularly vocal in her backing, describing how Connor's implied threats had made it difficult for her to maintain classroom discipline. "Dr. Mitchell, I've been teaching for 15 years and I've never seen students so openly disrespectful of authority," Mrs. Hayes said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "They act like the rules don't apply to them, and when we try to enforce consequences, They hide behind their parents' influence. What happened today with that video, it's exactly the kind of manipulation I've been dealing with in my classroom. But not all the feedback was supportive. Two parents called to request meetings, expressing concerns about whether Sarah's military background made her too rigid for the collaborative approach they expected from educational leadership. One father pointedly asked whether someone with combat experience could really understand the developmental needs of adolescents. By the end of the school day, Sarah had received over 30 emails and phone calls related to Madison's video. About half were supportive, coming from parents and community members who appreciated her service and believed she was being unfairly attacked. The other half ranged from concerned to hostile, with several demanding her immediate resignation and others calling for a thorough investigation of her qualifications. The most telling response came from Connor Walsh's father, Councilman Walsh, who called late in the afternoon with what he characterized as a helpful suggestion. His tone was carefully neutral, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm sure you're aware of the concerns that have been raised about your background and leadership style," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a long-serving politician. "I want you to know that I've been defending you in conversations with other community leaders, but there's only so much I can do if these controversies continue to escalate." Sarah listened patiently as Councilman Walsh outlined what he presented as a solution to the current crisis. If she were willing to take a more collaborative approach to discipline and show more flexibility in her interactions with families who had contributed significantly to the school's success, he was confident that the current controversy would fade away. The implicit message was clear: accommodate his son and the other privileged students or face continued political pressure that could force her resignation. "Councilman Walsh, I appreciate your concern," Sarah replied carefully, "but I think there may be a misunderstanding about my approach to leadership. I believe in treating all students equally and enforcing rules consistently, regardless of their family's position in the community. That's not inflexibility, that's fairness." The conversation ended cordially, but Sarah knew she had just declined an offer that wouldn't be repeated. From this point forward, she could expect the political pressure to intensify rather than diminish. Councilman Walsh and his allies would use every tool at their disposal to make her position untenable, and they had already demonstrated their willingness to wage their campaign in the court of public opinion. That evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen reviewing the day's events, while David worked on homework at the dining room table. She had deliberately avoided discussing the controversy with her son, not wanting to burden him with adult concerns, but she could see that he was aware something significant was happening. His friends at school would have seen Madison's video, and he was undoubtedly fielding questions about his mother's background. "Mom," David said suddenly, looking up from his math textbook. "Tyler Chen said his older sister is friends with Madison, Pierce, and she told him that Madison spent all weekend researching you. Is that true?" Sarah considered her response carefully. She had always been honest with David about the challenges of her job, but she also wanted to protect him from feeling responsible for the difficulties she was facing. "Some students have been asking questions about my background," she said finally. "They're trying to understand whether someone with military experience can be effective as a principal. It's created some controversy, but it's nothing I can't handle." David nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Are they doing this because they don't want to follow the rules?" Sarah smiled, despite the stress of the day. Her son had inherited her ability to see through complex situations to the underlying motivations. "That's a very perceptive observation," she replied. "What do you think?" "I think Connor Walsh is used to getting his way, and he doesn't like that you won't let him," David said matter-of-factly. Madison Pierce likes being the center of attention, and she probably thinks this will get her more followers. And Blake Rodriguez does whatever Connor tells him to do. The accuracy of his assessment struck Sarah as both impressive and concerning. If a 14-year-old could see through their motivations so clearly, it was troubling that adult community members were being swayed by their campaign. It suggested that the real issue wasn't whether people believed the accusations being made against her, but whether they wanted to believe them. As she tucked David into bed that night, Sarah made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. She would not resign, and she would not compromise her principles to appease influential families. If Connor Walsh and his allies wanted a fight, she would give them one, but it would be fought on her terms, using her strengths rather than theirs. What she didn't yet realize was that her opponents were already planning their next move, and it would be far more devastating than anything they had attempted so far. The following Monday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the California hills shimmer gold in the morning light. Sarah had spent the weekend developing a strategy for addressing the controversy that Madison's video had created, consulting with trusted colleagues and even reaching out to other administrators who had faced similar challenges in their careers. She felt prepared for whatever political pressure might emerge from the school board meeting scheduled for that Thursday. What she hadn't anticipated was the level of psychological warfare that 3 teenagers could orchestrate in the confined environment of a high school. Connor Walsh had spent the weekend coordinating with Madison and Blake to ensure that Sarah's Monday would be as difficult as possible, testing her composure and looking for any sign of the authoritarian behavior they had alleged in their campaign against her. The first incident occurred during the morning announcements. As Sarah spoke over the school's public address system, updating students and staff about upcoming events and policy reminders, a series of deliberate disruptions began echoing through the hallways. Connor had positioned himself and several friends at strategic locations throughout the building, and at predetermined intervals, they began slow clapping in response to Sarah's announcements. The clapping wasn't loud enough to clearly violate any specific rule, but it was perfectly timed to interrupt the flow of her speech and create an atmosphere of mockery that other students couldn't help but notice. Teachers in various classrooms looked around uncertainly, unsure whether they should address the disruption or ignore it. The slow clap carried implications that were unmistakable to anyone familiar with popular culture references to condescending. Applause. Sarah recognized the technique immediately. During her military service, she had dealt with similar attempts to undermine authority through coordinated disrespect that fell just short of outright insubordination. The perpetrators knew exactly how far they could push without crossing lines that would justify serious consequences, and they counted on their target's reluctance to appear heavy-handed in response to seemingly minor infractions. She finished the announcements without acknowledging the disruption, maintaining the calm professionalism that had become her trademark. But she also made mental notes about the timing and coordination of the clapping, recognizing it as evidence of advanced planning rather than spontaneous disrespect. This level of organization suggested that Connor and his allies were escalating their campaign beyond social media into direct confrontation. The second incident occurred during lunch period, when Madison Pierce staged what appeared to be a spontaneous interview with several underclassmen about their impressions of the new principal's leadership style. Madison positioned herself in the main hallway, where foot traffic was heaviest, using her phone to record what she presented as casual conversations with fellow students. The questions were carefully crafted to elicit responses that could be edited to support the narrative Madison had been building. She asked students whether they felt comfortable approaching the principal with problems, whether the disciplinary environment felt overly strict, and whether they thought military experience was relevant to educational leadership. Madison's followers among the upperclassmen made sure to provide responses that could be selectively quoted to make Sarah appear unapproachable and authoritarian. Sarah observed this performance from her office window, which provided a clear view of the main hallway. She watched Madison's technique with professional interest, noting how the teenager managed to create content that appeared spontaneous while actually being carefully choreographed. Several younger students who attempted to provide positive comments about Sarah's leadership found their responses interrupted or redirected by Madison's leading questions. The most sophisticated aspect of Madison's approach was her ability to maintain plausible deniability. If confronted about her activities, she could claim to be conducting legitimate journalism or simply engaging in normal social media content. Creation. The fact that her efforts were clearly designed to undermine Sarah's authority would be difficult to prove in any formal disciplinary proceeding. Tom Bradley stopped by Sarah's office during the lunch period to warn her about the hallway interviews and to gauge her reaction to the morning's coordinated disruptions. The vice principal's expression reflected both frustration and admiration for the complexity of what they were witnessing. "I have to admit, they're more sophisticated than I gave them credit for," Tom said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "This isn't typical teenage rebellion. They're running a campaign." Sarah nodded, appreciating Tom's recognition of what they were facing. "The question is whether we respond to individual incidents or address the pattern as a whole. They're counting on us treating each action as a separate, minor infraction rather than recognizing the coordinated nature of what they're doing." Before Tom could respond, Mrs. Chen knocked on the door with an expression that immediately signaled another crisis. She entered carrying a tablet, displaying what appeared to be a live social media stream, and her face was pale with concern. "Dr. Mitchell, Madison Pierce is broadcasting live right now from the school parking lot," Mrs. Chen reported. "She's interviewing parents who are here for early pickup, and she's asking them about their concerns regarding school safety and leadership. Some of the questions are getting very specific about your military background." Sarah accepted the tablet and watched as Madison conducted what appeared to be impromptu interviews with parents waiting in the pickup line. The teenager had positioned herself strategically near the main entrance, where she could approach parents without technically being on school property. Her questions focused on whether parents felt their children were safe under the current administration, and whether they had concerns about military-style discipline being implemented at Oakwood High. The most damaging moment came when Madison interviewed Mrs. Patterson, whose daughter was a sophomore and whose husband served on the school board. Mrs. Patterson expressed carefully worded concerns about the cultural changes she had observed since Sarah's appointment, mentioning rumors about increased detention rates and a less collaborative approach to parent communications. "I think we all support our military veterans," Mrs. Patterson said to Madison's camera. "But running a school requires different skills than managing soldiers. Our children need leaders who understand the importance of nurturing their emotional development, not just maintaining order." The interview was being streamed live to Madison's followers and simultaneously recorded for later distribution across multiple platforms. Within hours, edited clips would be circulating throughout the community, carefully selected to present the most critical perspectives while omitting any supportive comments that parents might have made. Sarah handed the tablet back to Mrs. Chen and took a moment to process the escalation she was witnessing. These three students had moved beyond attempting to undermine her authority within the school to actively damaging her reputation in the broader community. They were conducting what amounted to opposition research and strategic communications, using social media tools to shape public opinion about her fitness for the position. The afternoon brought yet another carefully orchestrated incident. During sixth period, Blake Rodriguez requested permission to leave his chemistry class to use the restroom. Instead of proceeding to the nearest facilities, he made his way to the main office area, where he positioned himself outside Sarah's door and began having a loud phone conversation with what appeared to be his father. The conversation was clearly intended to be overheard by office staff and any visitors who might be present. Blake spoke in urgent tones about his concerns for his safety at school, mentioning that several students were afraid to speak up about the hostile environment that had developed under the new administration. He made specific references to students feeling intimidated and uncertain about whether they could trust the principal to handle their concerns fairly. "Dad, I'm telling you, it's getting weird here," Blake said, his voice carrying perfectly to the reception area where Mrs. Chen and two visiting parents were conducting business. Everyone's walking on eggshells because they don't know how she's going to react to normal teenage stuff. It's like we're in boot camp or something. The performance was designed to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of anyone who happened to overhear it, while providing Blake with the cover that he was simply having a private conversation with his parent. If questioned about his comments, he could claim that he was sharing his honest feelings with his father and hadn't intended for anyone else to hear. Sarah had been trained to recognize psychological operations during her military service, and she knew she was witnessing a textbook example of an influence campaign designed to isolate her from potential allies while gradually building support for her removal. The coordination and timing of these incidents demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that impressed her, even as it frustrated her. But the most revealing aspect of the day's events was the response from other students and staff members. Sarah noticed that many of the teachers were watching her carefully, looking for signs of how she would handle the pressure being applied by Connor and his allies. Some students seemed genuinely concerned about the controversy, while others appeared to be enjoying the drama and chaos that had engulfed their normally predictable school environment. As the final bell rang and students began leaving for the day, Sarah reflected on the lessons she had learned during her first real day of coordinated psychological warfare in a civilian environment. Her opponents had demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to use social media, parent concerns, and institutional vulnerabilities to maximum effect. They had also shown remarkable discipline in avoiding any single action that would justify decisive disciplinary measures. But they had also revealed something crucial about their strategy and their weaknesses. Their campaign was built on the assumption that Sarah would respond predictably, either by overreacting to minor infractions or by backing down in the face of political pressure. They were counting on her being either too aggressive or too passive, never considering that she might have other options available. That evening, Sarah sat in her home office, developing what she would later describe as her most important lesson plan. She was preparing for a confrontation that she now understood was inevitable, and she intended to be ready for whatever Connor Walsh and his allies might attempt next. What she didn't know was that their next move would test not just her professional composure, but her ability to maintain the careful balance between her military training and her civilian responsibilities. The incident that would ultimately reveal who they were really dealing with was already being planned, and it would change everything at Oakwood High School forever. The weeks following Madison's social media campaign transformed Oakwood High School into a battleground where every interaction carried the potential for escalation. Sarah found herself navigating an environment where her authority was being challenged through 1,000 small cuts, each one designed to test her limits while avoiding any single action that would justify decisive retaliation. Connor Walsh and his allies had perfected the art of institutional harassment, using their understanding of school policies and parent politics to create maximum pressure with minimum risk. The campaign expanded beyond the original trio to include a growing network of students whose families had influence within the community. Sarah began noticing patterns in the timing and coordination of disruptions that suggested sophisticated planning and communication. Bathroom vandalism would occur simultaneously in multiple locations, requiring custodial staff to respond throughout the building while other incidents unfolded elsewhere. Fire alarm pulls happened during important meetings, forcing evacuations that disrupted her schedule and created chaos that could be blamed on unnamed troublemakers. Mrs. Hayes approached Sarah during the third week of the siege with documentation that revealed the true scope of what they were facing. The English teacher had been keeping detailed records of classroom disruptions, noting the timing, participants, and methods used to undermine her authority. The data painted a picture of coordinated psychological warfare that would have impressed military strategists. "Dr. Mitchell, they're using military tactics against us," Mrs. Hayes said, spreading her notes across Sarah's desk. "Look at this pattern. They never hit the same target twice in a row. They vary their methods to avoid detection, and they always have plausible deniability for individual actions. But when you map it out over time, it's clearly an organized campaign." The records showed that Connor's group had identified the most dedicated teachers and was systematically targeting them with disruptions designed to make their jobs impossible. They would arrive late to class with elaborate excuses, create distractions during important lessons, and challenge disciplinary measures with appeals to parent influence. Teachers who attempted to enforce consequences found themselves facing complaints from influential families who questioned their judgment and professionalism. Sarah studied the documentation with growing appreciation for both the sophistication of the attack and the dedication of teachers like Mrs. Hayes, who refused to be intimidated. The pattern revealed something else that she found encouraging. The conspiracy was smaller than it appeared. Most students were not participating in the coordinated harassment, but they were being influenced by the climate of chaos and disrespect that Connor's group had created. The breakthrough came when David approached her one evening with information he had gathered from his freshman friends. Her son had been reluctant to become involved in what he saw as adult conflicts, but he was increasingly concerned about the impact the situation was having on normal students who just wanted to learn and graduate. "Mum, I think I know how they're coordinating everything," David said, settling at the kitchen table where Sarah was reviewing budget reports. "Jake Morrison told me that Connor has a group chat with about 15 kids, and they plan stuff in advance. Madison posts the videos, Blake handles the physical stuff, and Connor manages the political side with parents and the school board." David explained that the group chat included students from wealthy families who had previously been untouchable when it came to disciplinary measures. They shared information about teacher schedules, administrative meetings, and parent communications, allowing them to time their disruptions for maximum impact. They also used the chat to ensure that their stories aligned when questioned by administrators, creating an echo chamber that reinforced their sense of invincibility. "The scary part is that some of the kids in the chat don't even like Connor," David continued, "but they're afraid that if they don't go along with him, he'll make their lives miserable, and their parents are worried about being excluded from the social groups that matter in Millbrook." This intelligence confirmed Sarah's suspicions about the social dynamics driving the conflict. Connor had weaponized the community's emphasis on status and belonging, creating a situation where opposition to his campaign carried social and economic costs that many families were unwilling to bear. Parents who might privately support Sarah's Leadership were reluctant to speak up if it meant risking their children's social standing or their own business relationships. The pressure on Sarah intensified when Councilman Walsh arranged for a special session of the school board to address community concerns about leadership and discipline policies at Oakwood High. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening and advertised through social media channels that ensured maximum attendance from parents who had been influenced by Madison's messaging campaign. Sarah spent days preparing for what she knew would be a carefully orchestrated attempt to force her resignation. She reviewed every decision she had made since taking the position, gathered documentation of the harassment campaign being waged against her, and consulted with education law attorneys about her rights and options. She also reached out to veterans, organizations, and civil rights groups who had experience dealing with discrimination based on military service. The school board meeting drew the largest crowd in Oakwood High's recent history. The high school auditorium was packed with parents, students, and community members, many of whom were attending their first board meeting ever. Sarah recognized several faces from Madison's video interviews, along with parents she had dealt with during various disciplinary incidents involving their children. Councilman Walsh had arranged for several speakers to address the board about their concerns regarding Sarah's leadership style and qualifications. The speakers had clearly been coached to avoid direct accusations while raising questions about her temperament, experience, and understanding of adolescent development. They spoke about the importance of collaborative leadership and expressed concerns about the militarization of educational discipline. Madison Pierce was given an opportunity to address the board as a student representative, and her presentation was a masterclass in political manipulation. She spoke eloquently about the anxiety and fear that students were experiencing under what she characterized as an authoritarian leadership style. Madison cited anonymous surveys she claimed to have conducted, presented statistics about increased detention rates, and showed carefully edited video clips of students expressing concerns about the school's direction. "We're not asking for principals who are our friends," Madison concluded, her voice carrying just the right note of mature concern. "But we need leaders who understand that education is about nurturing potential, not just maintaining order. When students are afraid to express themselves or ask for help because they're worried about military-style punishment, we're failing in our most basic educational mission." The presentation was devastating in its effectiveness, combining emotional appeals with carefully selected data to paint Sarah as both incompetent and dangerous. Madison had avoided making any statements that could be directly challenged, while creating an overall impression that supported the campaign for Sarah's removal. Blake Rodriguez spoke next, presenting himself as a concerned student-athlete who worried about the impact of policy changes on Oakwood High's successful sports programs. He suggested that Sarah's unfamiliarity with the traditions and culture that had made the school successful was leading to decisions that would harm student opportunities and community pride. Connor Walsh was the final student speaker, and his remarks demonstrated the political sophistication that made him such an effective leader of the opposition campaign. He began by acknowledging Sarah's military service and expressing respect for veterans, positioning himself as reasonable and patriotic rather than simply rebellious. Dr. Mitchell has served our country with honor, and we're grateful for her sacrifice, Connor said, his tone perfectly calibrated to sound sincere while delivering damaging implications. But leading soldiers in combat requires different skills than leading teenagers in school. We're concerned that the approach that was necessary in military environments might not be appropriate for the collaborative, nurturing environment that our children need to succeed. O'Connor went on to describe what he characterized as a pattern of inflexibility and authoritarianism that was stifling student creativity and damaging morale throughout the school. He cited specific incidents that had been taken out of context and reframed to support his narrative, presenting himself and his friends as reasonable advocates for positive change rather than privileged troublemakers resisting accountability. The public comment period that followed revealed the depth of the divide that had developed within the Oakwood High community. Supporters of Sarah spoke about her professionalism, fairness, and the positive changes they had observed in school discipline and academic focus. But they were outnumbered by critics who had been mobilized by the social media campaign and coached to express their concerns in terms of student welfare and educational philosophy. Several teachers attempted to speak in Sarah's defense, but they were clearly uncomfortable with the political arena and struggled to counter the sophisticated messaging that Connor's group had developed. Tom Bradley provided strong support, presenting data that showed improvements in attendance and academic performance since Sarah's appointment. But his presentation lacked the emotional impact of the student testimonials. When Sarah was finally given an opportunity to respond, she faced a hostile audience that had been primed to interpret anything she said as evidence of the authoritarian tendencies they had been warned about. She had prepared extensively for this moment, but she also understood that her words alone would not be sufficient to counter months of carefully crafted propaganda. Sarah began by acknowledging the concerns that had been raised while providing context for the decisions that had been criticized. She explained her philosophy of educational leadership, emphasizing fairness, consistency, and high expectations for all students, regardless of their family's influence or economic status. She presented her own data showing improvements in disciplinary outcomes and academic achievement since her appointment. But the most powerful part of her presentation came when she addressed the coordinated nature of the campaign against her leadership. Without naming specific students, Sarah described the pattern of harassment and manipulation that had been documented by teachers and staff. She challenged the board and community to consider whether the real issue was her leadership style or the resistance of privileged students to being held accountable for their behavior. I came to Oakwood High to provide educational leadership that serves all students equally, Sarah concluded. I will not apologize for enforcing rules consistently or for refusing to give special treatment to students whose families have influence in this community. If that makes me unsuitable for this position, then we have very different ideas about what educational leadership should look like. The board's response was mixed, reflecting the political pressure they were feeling from different segments of the community. Board President Thompson expressed support for Sarah's leadership while acknowledging the concerns that had been raised. Councilman Walsh pushed for a formal review of her performance and suggested that changes in leadership style might be necessary to restore community confidence. As the meeting concluded without any immediate resolution, Sarah realized that the political battle would continue and likely intensify. Connor Walsh and his allies had demonstrated their ability to mobilize community support and create sustained pressure for her removal. But they had also revealed something crucial about their strategy and their confidence level. They believed they had already won. The dismissive smiles and self-satisfied expressions Sarah observed as students and parents filed out of the auditorium told her everything she needed to know about their expectations. They thought the board meeting had been the decisive battle, and they were already anticipating her resignation or termination. What they didn't understand was that Sarah Mitchell had faced much more dangerous enemies in much more hostile environments. This was just the beginning of a conflict that they had initiated but were not prepared to finish. The real test would come when they pushed beyond political pressure to direct confrontation. and Sarah was already preparing for that moment. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave the auditorium, Sarah caught sight of Connor Walsh. Near the exit, surrounded by admirers and clearly basking in what he perceived as his triumph. Their eyes met for a moment, and Sarah saw the arrogant confidence of someone who believed he had successfully manipulated the adult world to serve his purposes. She smiled slightly and nodded in acknowledgement, a gesture that Connor interpreted as surrender, but that actually conveyed a very different message. Sarah was letting him know that she understood exactly what he had accomplished and that she was ready for whatever came next. The real confrontation was still ahead, and when it came, these three students would discover that they had been preparing for the wrong kind of fight entirely. November arrived with the kind of grey skies that seemed to reflect the mood at Oakwood High School. 6 weeks of sustained psychological warfare had taken their toll on everyone involved, creating an atmosphere of tension that affected students, teachers, and parents throughout the community. Sarah had weathered the political storm following the school board meeting, but she could feel the pressure mounting towards some kind of decisive confrontation that would determine her future at the school. The breaking point came during the annual Harvest Festival, Oakwood High's most important community fundraising event. The festival was scheduled for the first Saturday in November and represented the culmination of months of planning by students, teachers, and parent volunteers. More importantly, it was an opportunity for Sarah to demonstrate her leadership to the broader community in a positive, non-confrontational setting. Connor Walsh and his allies had been unusually quiet during the week leading up to the festival, a development that made Sarah more rather than less concerned about their intentions. Her military experience had taught her that enemies often became most dangerous when they appeared to have retreated, and she suspected that the relative calm was simply preparation for a more devastating attack. Madison Pierce had continued her social media campaign throughout October, but her recent posts had focused on general school issues rather than direct criticism of Sarah's leadership. Blake Rodriguez had been involved in several minor disciplinary incidents, but nothing that rose to the level of serious consequences. Connor had maintained his pattern of subtle disrespect and barely concealed insubordination, but he had avoided any direct confrontations that might justify suspension or other significant punishment. The festival preparations had consumed most of Sarah's attention during the week, coordinating with parent volunteers and ensuring that all safety protocols were properly implemented. The event featured carnival games, food booths, live music, and a silent auction that would raise funds for new computer equipment and athletic programs. It was exactly the kind of community-building activity that could help restore positive relationships between the school administration and local families. Sarah arrived at the school early Saturday morning to oversee the final setup, wearing casual clothes that she hoped would make her seem more approachable to parents who had only seen her in professional attire. The weather had cleared overnight, and the autumn sunshine promised perfect conditions for the outdoor activities that were planned throughout the campus. Tom Bradley met her in the main parking lot, where vendors were already setting up booths and testing their equipment. The vice principal looked more relaxed than he had in weeks, clearly grateful for an opportunity to focus on positive school activities rather than disciplinary crises and political controversies. "This might be exactly what we need," Tom said as they walked through the festival area, checking on various preparations. "A chance for people to see you in a different context, working with the community instead of being attacked by it." Sarah nodded, sharing his optimism while remaining alert for any signs that Connor's group might be planning some kind of disruption. She had learned to read the subtle indicators that preceded their coordinated attacks and something about the quiet confidence she had observed in Madison's recent social media posts made her suspect that they were planning something significant. The festival officially opened at 10 in the morning, and within an hour, the campus was filled with families enjoying the various activities and attractions. Sarah moved through the crowd, greeting parents and students, answering questions about school programs, and generally trying to demonstrate the collaborative leadership style that her critics claimed she lacked. The morning passed without incident, and Sarah began to relax slightly as she observed the positive interactions happening throughout the festival. Parents who had been influenced by the negative publicity were able to see her in a more natural setting, and many seemed pleasantly surprised by her warmth and accessibility. Several teachers commented on the difference they noticed in community attitudes when people could interact with Sarah directly rather than relying on second-hand reports and social media narratives. Connor Walsh arrived at the festival around noon, accompanied by his usual entourage and several parents who were clearly part of his family's social circle. Sarah observed his entrance from across the campus, noting the confident way he surveyed the scene as if assessing targets of opportunity. Madison Pierce and Blake Rodriguez appeared shortly afterward, and Sarah watched as the three students moved through the crowd with the casual authority of people who considered themselves the unofficial hosts of the event. The first sign of trouble came during the early afternoon, when Sarah was helping to judge a student art competition near the main stage. Madison Pierce positioned herself strategically in the background of the judging area and began live streaming what she presented. As behind-the-scenes coverage of the festival, her commentary focused on the decision-making process for the art awards, suggesting that the judging might be influenced by political considerations rather than artistic merit. "I'm not saying there's anything wrong with how the judging is being conducted," Madison said to her phone camera, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard by nearby parents. "But it's interesting to see how much input Dr. Mitchell is providing about which pieces should win. I thought art competitions were supposed to be judged by art teachers and community volunteers, not school administrators." The implication was subtle but clear. Sarah was micromanaging even activities that should be handled by others, demonstrating the controlling tendencies that Madison's campaign had been highlighting for weeks. Parents who overheard the commentary began paying closer attention to Sarah's interactions with the other judges, looking for evidence to support or contradict Madison's suggestion. Sarah recognized the technique immediately and made a conscious decision to reduce her participation in the judging process, stepping back to allow the art teachers and parent volunteers to make their decisions without her input. But the damage was already done. Madison had successfully planted seeds of doubt about Sarah's motivations and management style in the minds of observing parents. Blake Rodriguez contributed to the campaign by positioning himself near the food service area, where he began loudly expressing concerns about the organization and efficiency of the festival operations. His comments were carefully crafted to sound like helpful observations rather than criticism, but the underlying message was that the event was poorly managed and chaotic under Sarah's leadership. "I hope we're going to have enough food for everyone," Blake said to a group of students and parents waiting in line for hamburgers. "It seems like there might have been some miscommunication about how many people were expected to attend. Last year, everything ran so smoothly under Mr. Garrison's organization." The comparison to the previous principal was particularly damaging because it suggested that the festival had been better managed in the past, implying that Sarah's leadership was responsible for any problems or inefficiencies that people might notice. Blake's comments spread through the crowd as people began looking for evidence of organizational failures and comparing their current experience to previous years. Connor Walsh waited until mid-afternoon to make his move, timing his action for maximum impact when the festival crowd was at its largest and most diverse. Sarah was near the main stage, preparing to introduce the next musical performance, when she noticed Connor approaching with what appeared to be a group of concerned parents. The confrontation began when Connor interrupted Sarah's conversation, with the band director inserting himself into the discussion with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he had every right to be involved in administrative decisions. His tone was respectful and his words were carefully chosen, but his presence immediately changed the dynamic of the interaction. "Dr. Mitchell, I hope you don't mind me interrupting," Connor said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "These parents have some questions about the festival organization, and I told them you'd be happy to address their concerns directly." The parents Connor had brought with him were all from influential families, and their questions were clearly coordinated to put Sarah in the most difficult position possible. They asked about budget allocations for the festival, questioned decisions about vendor selection, and expressed concerns about safety protocols that they claimed were different from previous years. Each question was reasonable on its surface, but together they created an impression that Sarah was being held accountable for problems that may or may not have actually existed. The parents' tone was polite but persistent, and their questions were designed to be difficult to answer quickly or definitively in a public setting. Sarah handled the interrogation with professional grace, providing clear answers to the substantive questions while recognizing the political theater that was being performed for the benefit of nearby parents and students. She could see that Connor was recording the interaction with his phone, undoubtedly planning to edit the footage to support whatever narrative he intended to promote on social media. The situation escalated when one of the parents, Mrs. Wellington, began asking pointed questions about Sarah's decision-making process and her qualifications for managing large community events. Mrs. Wellington was Connor's aunt and a prominent figure in Millbrook society, and her questioning carried the weight of family influence and social authority. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm curious about your background in event management," Mrs. Wellington said, her voice carrying clearly to the growing crowd of onlookers. "Running a community festival requires specific skills and experience. What training have you had in coordinating activities of this scale?" The question was designed to highlight Sarah's military background in a way that made it seem irrelevant or potentially problematic for civilian community events. Mrs. Wellington's tone suggested that she already doubted Sarah's qualifications and was simply providing an opportunity for her to demonstrate her inadequacy publicly. Sarah recognized the trap being set for her and responded with the kind of measured professionalism that had served her well throughout her career. She outlined her experience managing large-scale events during her military service, described the coordination skills required for base operations, and explained how those abilities translated directly to educational and community leadership. But Mrs. Wellington wasn't satisfied with Sarah's response. She pressed further, asking specific questions about civilian event management certification and suggesting that military experience might not be sufficient preparation for the collaborative approach required in educational settings. "I'm sure your military experience was valuable in its context," Mrs. Wellington continued, her voice taking on a slightly condescending tone. "But managing soldiers is quite different from working with parents and students, isn't it? Don't you think this community deserves leaders who understand the specific challenges of civilian educational environments?" The crowd around them had grown larger as more parents and students became aware of the confrontation taking place near the main stage. Sarah could see teachers and staff members watching nervously, clearly concerned about the potential for the situation to escalate beyond their ability to manage. Connor Walsh stood slightly behind his aunt, his expression perfectly composed, but his eyes bright with anticipation. He was clearly enjoying the spectacle of an adult authority figure being challenged publicly, and he seemed confident that the confrontation would end with Sarah appearing defensive or authoritarian in front of the community she was supposed to serve. Madison Pierce had positioned herself where she could live stream the entire interaction, providing real-time commentary that framed the confrontation as evidence of the concerns that her campaign had been raising about Sarah's leadership, style, and qualifications. Her social media followers were watching a community leader being held accountable by concerned parents, exactly the kind of content that had made Madison's previous videos so effective. Sarah felt the familiar sensation she had experienced before. Every significant military operation, a heightening of awareness, a slowing of time, and a crystalline clarity about the choices available to her. She understood that this was the moment Connor and his allies had been building toward for months, the public confrontation that would either destroy her credibility or reveal who they were really dealing with. The crowd was waiting for her response to Mrs. Wellington's challenge, and Sarah knew that her next words would determine not just the outcome of this immediate confrontation, but her future at Oakwood High School. She could respond defensively, trying to justify her qualifications and appease the concerns being raised. She could become angry or authoritarian, confirming the accusations that had been made against her leadership style. Or she could do something that none of her opponents expected. Sarah smiled calmly and took a step closer to Mrs. Wellington, her posture relaxed, but somehow commanding the attention of everyone present. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority that had once been responsible for managing thousands of Marines in combat zones. Mrs. Wellington, you raise an excellent question about leadership qualifications, Sarah said, her tone remaining perfectly professional, while something in her eyes shifted in a way that made Connor's confident expression falter slightly. You're absolutely right that managing different groups requires different approaches. The question is whether you really want to discover what approaches I'm capable of using when the situation requires them. The subtle change in Sarah's demeanor was immediately apparent to everyone present, but especially to Connor, Madison, and Blake, who suddenly realized that they might have pushed too far. The quiet, accommodating educator they thought they had been manipulating was gone, replaced by someone whose presence commanded attention in a way that made further challenges seem inadvisable. Mrs. Wellington seemed momentarily uncertain about how to respond to Sarah's shift in tone, clearly recognizing that the dynamic of the confrontation had changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, but not entirely understanding what was happening. Connor Walsh felt the first stirring of genuine concern as he looked at Sarah's expression and realized that he might have badly miscalculated the nature of the person he had been targeting for months. The confident smile he had been wearing throughout the festival began to fade as he considered the possibility that his campaign of harassment might have consequences he hadn't anticipated. But it was too late to retreat now. The confrontation was being broadcast live to hundreds of followers, recorded by multiple phones and witnessed by a significant portion of the Oakwood High community. Whatever happened next would determine the future of everyone involved, and the next few minutes would reveal exactly who Dr. Sarah Mitchell really was when pushed beyond her breaking point. The moment of truth had finally arrived, and everyone present seemed to sense that they were about to witness something that would change everything at Oakwood High School forever. The silence that followed Sarah's response stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it lasted only seconds. The festival crowd had unconsciously formed a circle around the confrontation, drawn by the magnetic tension that seemed to radiate from the small group near the main stage. Children continued playing on the carnival rides in the distance, their laughter creating an almost surreal contrast to the charged atmosphere where Sarah Mitchell faced down her tormentors. Mrs. Wellington recovered her composure first. Her years of social prominence giving her the confidence to press what she believed was her advantage. Dr. Mitchell, I think your response proves exactly what we've been concerned about. That tone, that implied threat, it's precisely the kind of intimidation that has no place in educational leadership. Connor Walsh stepped forward slightly, sensing an opportunity to capitalize on what he interpreted as Sarah's mistake. His phone was still recording, and he could already envision how this footage would be edited and distributed to support their campaign. Dr. Mitchell, Mrs. Wellington is just asking reasonable questions that any concerned parent would ask. If you can't handle that kind of accountability, maybe this position isn't right for you. Madison Pierce continued live streaming, her commentary designed to frame Sarah's response as evidence of the authoritarian tendencies they had been warning about for months. You can see the aggressive body language, the intimidating tone. Madison whispered to her audience, "This is exactly what students have been afraid of. This is why we've been speaking out." Blake Rodriguez moved closer to Connor's position. His athletic build, an imposing presence intended to provide physical intimidation that would support the psychological pressure being applied. The three students had coordinated this moment perfectly, creating multiple angles of attack while ensuring that Sarah's response would be captured and broadcast to their advantage. What they hadn't anticipated was the calm precision with which Sarah began to dismantle their strategy. Her military training had taught her to identify the key elements of any operation, and she could see exactly how Connor's group had positioned themselves to control the narrative of this confrontation. More importantly, she could see the weaknesses in their approach that they hadn't considered. "Mr. Walsh," Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone present lean in to hear her words. "You mentioned that Mrs. Wellington is asking reasonable questions that any concerned parent would ask. That's an interesting observation, considering that Mrs. Wellington isn't actually a parent of any current Oakwood High students." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd as people processed this information. Mrs. Wellington's face flushed slightly as she realized that Sarah had done her homework and wasn't going to allow misrepresentations to stand unchallenged. Sarah continued without giving anyone time to respond. Mrs. Wellington's youngest child graduated from Oakwood High 3 years ago, which makes her presence here today purely as your advocate, Connor, rather than as a concerned parent with current stakes in this school's leadership. The revelation shifted the dynamic of the confrontation immediately. What had appeared to be a spontaneous challenge from concerned parents was now revealed as a coordinated attack using family connections to create the illusion of broader community concern. Parents in the crowd began looking at each other with raised eyebrows, recognizing that they had been witnessing political theater rather than authentic accountability. Connor's confident expression faltered as he realized that Sarah had identified the manipulation tactics his group had been using. But he had committed too much to this confrontation to retreat now, and his response revealed the entitled arrogance that had been hidden beneath his veneer of reasonable concern. "So what if she's my aunt?" Connor snapped, his careful composure cracking under pressure. "That doesn't change the fact that you're not qualified for this job. Everyone knows you only got hired because the school board felt sorry for you after your divorce. A real leader wouldn't need to hide behind technicalities when people ask legitimate questions." The personal attack crossed a line that even Connor's allies recognized as problematic. Several parents in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Tom Bradley started moving toward the confrontation from across the festival grounds. Madison Pierce's live stream commentary became noticeably more defensive as she tried to distance herself from Connor's escalation while maintaining support for their overall campaign. But Connor wasn't finished. The months of careful planning and gradual pressure had led to this moment. and he was determined to achieve the decisive victory that would establish his dominance once and for all. Face it, Dr. Mitchell, you don't belong here. This community deserves better than someone who couldn't even keep her own marriage together trying to tell our kids how to behave. The attack on Sarah's personal life was the mistake that Connor's group had been building toward without realizing it. They had spent so much time focusing on her professional qualifications and leadership style that they had failed to consider what would happen if they made the conflict personal in front of a community audience. Sarah's response was swift and devastating in its precision. She stepped forward until she was directly in front of Connor, close enough that their conversation became clearly audible to the entire crowd, but far enough away to avoid any appearance of physical intimidation. "Mr. Walsh," Sarah said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "you've just made 3 critical errors that are going to change your life in ways you haven't considered." Connor tried to maintain his defiant posture, but something in Sarah's tone made him take an involuntary step backward. The crowd had gone completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing a turning point that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. "First," Sarah continued, her words carrying the precise cadence of a military briefing, "you've just demonstrated the disrespect and entitlement that your teachers have been documenting for months. Every person here has now witnessed exactly the kind of behavior that has been disrupting classrooms and undermining educational effectiveness at this school." Madison Pierce tried to interject, her phone still recording as she attempted to control the narrative. "Dr. Mitchell, Connor is just expressing legitimate concerns that many students and parents share. You're proving our point about your authoritarian approach by trying to intimidate him in front of everyone." Sarah turned to Madison with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Pierce, you've been live streaming what you believe is evidence of my inappropriate response to student concerns. What you've actually been broadcasting is a coordinated harassment campaign that involves cyberbullying, organized disruption of educational activities, and the manipulation of community concerns for personal gain." The accuracy of Sarah's assessment sent a visible shock through Madison's confident demeanor. The teenager suddenly realized that her social media activities might be viewed very differently by adults who understood the legal and ethical implications of her actions. "Second," Sarah continued, turning back to Connor, "you've just made personal attacks against a school administrator in front of witnesses, which constitutes harassment and creates liability issues that extend far beyond typical student discipline. Your father's position on the city council won't protect you from the consequences of your choices today." Blake Rodriguez finally spoke up, his voice lacking the confidence he had displayed throughout their months-long campaign. "Dr. Mitchell, we're just trying to have a conversation about school leadership. You're the one who's making this into something bigger than it needs to be." Sarah's response revealed the extent of her preparation for this moment. "Mr. Rodriguez, you and your friends have been conducting what the military would classify as psychological operations designed to undermine institutional authority. You've coordinated disruptions, spread disinformation, and attempted to manipulate public opinion through strategic communications. This isn't a conversation about school leadership. It's the culmination of a deliberate campaign that you've been planning for months." The precision of Sarah's analysis left the 3 students speechless. They had believed their activities were subtle and untraceable, never considering that someone with military intelligence training would be able to identify and document their tactics with professional accuracy. "And third," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a level that somehow commanded even more attention than her previous statements, "you've chosen to target someone whose background you never bothered to understand. You researched my divorce, my family situation, and my career transition, but you never looked into what I actually did during my 15 years of military service." Connor Walsh's face had gone pale as he began to understand that he might have made a catastrophic miscalculation. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice lacking the bravado that had characterized his challenge just moments before. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, it was a genuine expression of satisfaction. "I wasn't just a Marine commander, Mr. Walsh. I was a military police commander responsible for maintaining order in combat zones, where actual enemies were trying to kill the people under my protection. I've dealt with insurgents, war criminals, and hostile foreign nationals who posed real threats to American lives." The crowd's attention was now completely focused on Sarah as she revealed the background that had been selectively presented in Madison's social media campaign, but never fully understood by her opponents. "I've interrogated prisoners of war, managed detention facilities, and maintained discipline among thousands of Marines under the most stressful conditions imaginable. I faced down armed enemies and hostile crowds in environments where mistakes cost lives rather than just hurt feelings." Madison Pierce's livestream had devolved into nervous commentary as she tried to process the implications of what Sarah was revealing. Her followers were witnessing the complete dismantling of the narrative she had been building for months. "The techniques you've been using against me," Sarah continued, her voice gaining intensity as she described the scope of their miscalculation. "The psychological pressure, the coordinated harassment, the manipulation of public opinion, I've seen them all before. I've faced them from actual enemies in actual combat zones where the stakes were life and death rather than high school politics." Blake Rodriguez was now visibly sweating despite the cool November air. "Dr. Mitchell, we never meant for things to get this serious. We were just trying to make our voices heard." Sarah's response revealed the depth of documentation she had been maintaining throughout their campaign. "Mr. Rodriguez, your group has violated multiple school policies, potentially several state laws regarding cyberbullying and harassment, and created a hostile educational environment that has affected dozens of students and teachers. This stopped being about making your voices heard when you decided to wage psychological warfare against a school administrator." The crowd was beginning to understand that they had been witnessing something far more significant than a typical dispute between students and school leadership. Parents who had been influenced by Madison's social media campaign were recognizing how they had been manipulated, and teachers who had suffered through months of coordinated disruption were finally seeing justice. Connor Walsh made one final attempt to salvage the situation, falling back on the family influence that had protected him throughout his high school career. "My father is going to hear about this, Dr. Mitchell. You can't threaten students just because they ask hard questions about your qualifications." Sarah's response revealed the extent of her preparation for this exact moment. "Mr. Walsh, your father will indeed hear about this, but not in the way you're expecting. I've been documenting your group's activities since September, and I've been consulting with education law attorneys about the appropriate responses to coordinated harassment campaigns." Why, she paused, allowing the implications of her words to sink in before delivering the final blow to their sense of invulnerability. "Tomorrow morning, your parents will receive formal notifications about disciplinary proceedings that will include recommendations for suspension, community service, mandatory counseling, and possible legal referrals depending on the outcomes of investigations into your social media activities and harassment campaign." Udin, Madison Pierce's phone finally stopped recording as she realized that her live stream had captured evidence of the conspiracy she had been trying to expose as legitimate student advocacy. "Dr. Mitchell, you can't prove that we coordinated anything. We were just expressing our individual concerns about school leadership." Sarah's smile became genuinely warm for the first time during the confrontation. "Miss Pierce, you've been live streaming and posting videos about your activities for months. Mr. Walsh has been organizing your group through social media platforms that maintain records of all communications. Mr. Rodriguez has been implementing plans that required advanced coordination and timing. You've created a comprehensive evidence trail that documents every aspect of your campaign." The three students stood in stunned silence as they realized that their own social media activities had provided the evidence that would be used against them in disciplinary proceedings. They had been so confident in their ability to manipulate adult authority figures that they had never considered the possibility that their communications and actions were being monitored and documented by someone with professional training in intelligence analysis. Tom Bradley arrived at the scene as Sarah was concluding her response to Connor's group. The vice principal's expression reflected both relief and amazement as he observed the complete reversal of power dynamics that had taken place during the confrontation. "Dr. Mitchell," Tom said, his voice carrying clearly to the assembled crowd, "is there anything you need assistance with regarding this situation?" Sarah's response demonstrated the professional composure that had characterized her leadership throughout the months of harassment she had endured. "Mr. Bradley, please coordinate with campus security to ensure that our festival activities can continue without further disruption. I'll be meeting with these students and their parents in my office on Monday morning to discuss the consequences of their actions and the steps we'll be taking to restore the positive educational environment that all our students deserve." The crowd began to disperse as people recognized that the confrontation had reached its conclusion. Parents who had been influenced by months of negative publicity were now seeing Sarah's leadership in an entirely different light, and students who had been watching the power struggle were beginning to understand that the rules applied equally to everyone, regardless of their family's influence. Connor Walsh, Madison Pierce, and Blake Rodriguez found themselves standing alone near the main stage, abandoned by the crowd that had gathered to witness what they expected to be Sarah's humiliation. Their months of careful planning had collapsed in a matter of minutes, and they were now facing consequences that would follow them through the remainder of their high school careers and beyond. The following Monday morning brought a steady stream of visitors to Sarah's office as parents arrived for the disciplinary meetings that would determine their children's futures at Oakwood High School. Councilman Walsh entered with the aggressive confidence that had characterized his previous interactions with school administrators, but his demeanor changed noticeably when Sarah presented the comprehensive documentation of his son's harassment campaign. "Dr. Mitchell, I think there may be some misunderstanding about Connor's activities," Councilman Walsh began, his tone suggesting that political pressure might still be effective in resolving the situation. Sarah's response revealed the extent of her preparation for this exact conversation. "Councilman Walsh, there's no misunderstanding about what your son and his friends have been doing for the past 3 months. I have documented evidence of coordinated harassment, cyberbullying, disruption of educational activities, and personal attacks that constitute clear violations of school policy and potentially state law." She opened a thick folder containing printouts of social media posts, witness statements from teachers and students, and communication records that painted a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy that had been targeting her leadership. "Your son organized a systematic campaign to undermine my authority through psychological pressure, manipulation of public opinion, and harassment of school staff. He recruited other students from influential families to participate in coordinated disruptions and used his family's political connections to create pressure for my resignation." Councilman Walsh reviewed the documentation with growing concern, recognizing that his son's activities had created legal and political vulnerabilities that extended far beyond typical teenage misbehavior. Madison Pierce's parents arrived with their family attorney, clearly expecting to challenge any disciplinary measures through legal intimidation. But Sarah's presentation of the evidence from Madison's own social media accounts left little room for dispute about the nature and extent of her activities. Miss Pierce has been conducting what amounts to a defamation campaign against school leadership, Sarah explained to the assembled adults. She's used social media platforms to spread selective information designed to damage my reputation and undermine community confidence in school administration. Her activities constitute cyberbullying under state law and create potential liability issues for the school district. The attorney advised Madison's parents that challenging the disciplinary measures would likely result in greater scrutiny of their daughter's social media activities and potential legal consequences that would be far more serious than school suspension. Blake Rodriguez's parents were the most cooperative, recognizing that their son had been following Connor's leadership rather than initiating harassment activities. They agreed to the recommended consequences and expressed support for Sarah's efforts to restore order and respect to the school environment. The disciplinary outcomes reflected the severity of the campaign that had been waged against Sarah's leadership. Connor Walsh received a 2-week suspension, mandatory anger management counseling, and a requirement to complete 100 hours of community service focused on understanding the impact of harassment on educational environments. His college recommendation letters would include documentation of his disciplinary record, and his participation in school leadership activities was terminated immediately. Madison Pierce faced similar consequences with additional requirements related to her social media activities. She was required to publish public apologies for her harassment campaign, participate in cyberbullying prevention education, and submit all future social media content related to school activities for administrative review. Her live streaming privileges were revoked, and her access to school Wi-Fi networks was restricted. Blake Rodriguez received a 1-week suspension and mandatory counseling, with recognition that his participation had been primarily as a follower rather than a leader of the harassment campaign. His consequences included requirements to write formal apologies to the teachers and staff members who had been affected by the coordinated disruptions. The broader impact of the disciplinary actions extended throughout the Oakwood High community as word spread about the comprehensive nature of Sarah's documentation and the serious consequences that had been imposed. Students who had been considering similar challenges to authority recognized that such behavior would not be tolerated, and teachers who had been struggling with entitled student behavior found renewed support for their classroom management efforts. The most significant change came in the relationship between Sarah and the broader parent community. The Harvest Festival confrontation had revealed the manipulative nature of the campaign against her leadership, and many parents who had been influenced by negative publicity began reaching out to express their support and apologize for their previous concerns. Mrs. Patterson, the school board member whose wife had expressed concerns in Madison's videos, requested a private meeting with Sarah to discuss the situation and offer formal support for her leadership. "Dr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology," Mrs. Patterson said during their conversation. "My wife and I were influenced by the narrative that was being promoted through social media, and we didn't take the time to investigate the full context of what was happening. Your handling of this situation has demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership our school needs." The school board's monthly meeting in December was a stark contrast to the contentious session that had taken place in October. Parents and community members who attended expressed strong support for Sarah's leadership and praised her handling of the harassment campaign. The board voted unanimously to renew her contract for the following academic year, and Superintendent Williams publicly commended her professional response to unprecedented challenges. Connor Walsh returned to school after his suspension with a noticeably different attitude toward authority and consequences. His previous confidence had been replaced by a wariness that suggested genuine understanding of the seriousness of his actions. He completed his community service requirements without complaint and gradually rebuilt relationships with teachers and staff members who had been targets of his harassment campaign. Madison Pierce struggled more significantly with the transition, finding that her social media influence had been permanently damaged by the exposure of her manipulation tactics. Her follower count dropped dramatically as people recognized how they had been used to advance her personal agenda, and her attempts to rebuild her online presence were met with skepticism and criticism. Blake Rodriguez adapted most successfully to the new environment, using his experience as a learning opportunity to develop genuine leadership skills, rather than relying on intimidation and family influence. He became an advocate for respectful behavior among student athletes and worked to rebuild the reputation of the sports programs that had been damaged by the entitled behavior of some participants. The spring semester at Oakwood High School was characterized by a renewed focus on academic achievement and respectful behavior that reflected the clear boundaries Sarah had established through her handling of the harassment campaign. Test scores improved, disciplinary incidents decreased, and teacher morale reached levels that hadn't been seen in years. Sarah's leadership style evolved as well, incorporating lessons learned from her first year of civilian educational administration. She maintained the high standards and consistent enforcement that had characterized her military service while developing more collaborative approaches to working with students, parents, and community members who were genuinely committed to educational excellence. The most lasting impact of the confrontation came in the form of policy changes that would protect future administrators from similar harassment campaigns. The school district implemented new protocols for addressing cyberbullying, established clearer consequences for coordinated disruption activities, and created support systems for educational leaders facing political pressure from influential families. As Sarah reflected on her first year at Oakwood High School during the final faculty meeting of the academic year, she recognized that the challenges she had faced had ultimately strengthened both her leadership abilities and the school's educational environment. The harassment campaign that had been designed to force her resignation had instead revealed the character and determination that made her effective as an educational leader. The 3 students who had orchestrated the campaign against her had learned valuable lessons about respect, consequences, and the importance of genuine leadership rather than manipulation and intimidation. Their experiences would follow them into their college years and beyond, shaping their understanding of appropriate behavior in professional and academic environments. Most importantly, the Oakwood High School community had learned that effective leadership sometimes requires the courage to confront entitled behavior and enforce consistent standards regardless of political pressure or family influence. Sarah's military background had provided the training and experience necessary to recognize and respond to sophisticated manipulation tactics. But her success as an educational leader came from her commitment to serving all students equally and maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. The legacy of that November afternoon at the Harvest Festival would continue to influence the culture at Oakwood High School for years to come, serving as a reminder that authentic leadership requires both strength and wisdom, and that the most effective educators are those who understand that protecting the learning environment sometimes means standing up to those who would compromise it for personal gain. Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.